Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be taking a look back at 1986.
Wow. 1986.
Yeah, we're going to be exploring the IWGIA yearbook
Oh, wow.
from that year, which really is kind of a powerful snapshot of what was happening globally in terms of the movement for Indigenous peoples' human rights.
It really is. And this yearbook is more than just, a collection of facts and figures. It really brings you right to the heart of this global movement. You get to hear firsthand accounts.
Yeah.
You get reports from activists on the ground.
Yeah, an expert analysis.
Right.
It's incredible to think that it's all captured in this one book.
Absolutely.
So just to give folks some context, IWGIA stands for International Work Group
That's right.
from Indigenous Affairs, and they're an independent organization that has been tirelessly supporting Indigenous peoples worldwide.
Yeah.
And the yearbook is one of their key initiatives, shining a light on the challenges these communities face.
And what makes the 1986 edition so fascinating is that it really captures this pivotal moment.
Yeah.
The movement for Indigenous rights was gaining momentum,
Yeah.
but the obstacles were, and still are, immense.
Yeah. That's kind of what we're going to look into today. It's like trying to fit an entire planet's worth of stories into a single book.
Exactly.
So where do we even begin?
Well, the yearbook starts by setting the scene globally, highlighting the common threads that link Indigenous communities in 1986. And the one word that echoes throughout, self-determination.
Self-determination. Yeah, I found that to be super powerful in reading through this. And it's not just about like Indigenous peoples having their own land or their own governments. It's much deeper than that.
Oh, it absolutely is. Self-determination for Indigenous peoples means having the right to shape their own destinies, their own development, their own cultures, their own futures.
Yeah.
It's about ensuring that their ways of life are respected and that they are not forced to assimilate into dominant societies.
There's a quote from the yearbook that really stuck with me, and it says that Indigenous peoples see themselves as caretakers of the earth for their descendants.
That's beautiful.
It's a beautiful way of putting it.
It really highlights their long-term vision,
Yeah.
this inherent sense of responsibility that extends not just to the present, but to generations to come. And this perspective is often fundamentally at odds with the forces of colonization, both past and present, that continue to impact the lives of so many Indigenous communities.
Colonization, I feel like that's something that we think of as something that happened a long time ago. How does the yearbook break down this idea?
Well, colonization might feel like a historical event, but the reality is it's still very much a present-day force. And the yearbook identifies several ways that it continues to play out. Political control. So Indigenous communities are often marginalized within nation states.
Yeah.
Resource extraction, where
Yeah.
their lands are exploited for profit.
Yeah.
And the imposition of ideologies that undermine Indigenous values and ways of knowing.
Right, like those three things work together almost to maintain a system of control.
Exactly. They reinforce each other, making it incredibly difficult for Indigenous communities to exercise their right to self-determination.
Yeah. And the yearbook is packed with examples of this playing out in real life. And it's gut-wrenching to read some of these. For example, the Indonesian government's transmigration program.
Yes. That's a prime example of how colonization can displace Indigenous peoples. So the Indonesian government has been moving millions of people from densely populated islands to outer islands, like Sumatra, Kalimantan, and West Papua. And these outer islands are home to many Indigenous communities.
And it's actually shocking to read that the World Bank was funding 1% of this program.
10%. That's a staggering $600 million.
Yeah.
You know, it really makes you think twice about who benefits from these so-called development schemes.
Absolutely. And that's not the only thing. It's not just happening in Indonesia. The yearbook also talks about hydroelectric dam projects, and these are all across the Americas, impacting Indigenous communities there.
Think about the ripple effects of these dams. Disrupted fishing grounds, flooded sacred sites, entire communities forced to relocate.
Yeah.
And it's happening in Brazil, Paraguay, even the United States.
Then you've got the constant pressure from mining and logging operations. And the yearbook specifically mentions the Lubicon Cree in Canada, who have been fighting for decades against oil companies encroaching on their land. It's heartbreaking how often profit trumps human rights.
And all of these factors contribute to the systemic human rights abuses that are faced by Indigenous peoples worldwide.
So let's delve into those violations a bit more. What specific abuses does the yearbook document?
Well, the yearbook paints a very sobering picture. It talks about poverty, it talks about the lack of access to healthcare, to education, discrimination and violence, all disproportionately impacting Indigenous communities. And it's a stark reminder that these issues are not just historical. They are very much present today.
The yearbook does not hold back on the details. It highlights the alarming number of killings and massacres reported in places like Guatemala and El Salvador during this period.
And these acts of violence are not isolated incidents. Yeah. They're part of a larger pattern of intimidation and repression, aimed at silencing indigenous voices and undermining their movements.
The yearbook also discusses the impact of forced relocation. And I mean being torn from your ancestral land, your home, the very foundation of your culture.
It's hard to even imagine the trauma that would cause.
Yeah.
And the yearbook uses examples from all corners of the globe: Ethiopia, Peru, Guatemala, South Africa.
Wow.
This is a widespread practice.
And then there's the issue of nuclear testing.
Yes.
Which, I mean, indigenous communities have really borne the brunt of this.
Yes, facing long-term health and environmental consequences as a result.
The Western Shoshone in Nevada and the people of Rongelap in the Marshall Islands, both communities have seen their land contaminated by nuclear fallout, leaving this legacy of suffering for generations.
Absolutely. And these stories are stark reminders of the devastating and long-lasting damage that these activities inflict. They highlight the environmental injustice that is often woven into the fabric of colonization.
It feels like a lot of bad news.
Yeah.
But I know that there are also stories of resistance and advocacy.
Absolutely. Despite these immense challenges, indigenous communities are not backing down. They're fighting back with incredible resilience and creativity. And let's explore some of those inspiring strategies.
Okay. I'm ready for some good news.
One of the key takeaways from the yearbook is the power of indigenous-led organizations and movements.
Yeah.
These groups are challenging the status quo, they're demanding recognition of their rights, and they're working tirelessly to protect their cultures and their lands.
So they're not just waiting for someone else to come save them.
No, they're taking charge of their own destiny.
Yeah.
And this self-reliance and determination are truly inspiring.
Yeah, absolutely. For example, the yearbook talks about the ILO Convention 107.
Yes.
Which is an international treaty focused on indigenous and tribal peoples. I will admit, I don't really know how these international agreements work.
Oh, well, international conventions like ILO 107 are basically agreements between countries that set standards for how they'll treat specific groups or handle certain issues.
Yeah.
They're meant to protect the rights of vulnerable populations.
Okay. So in this case, it's about ensuring that indigenous peoples are treated fairly and that their rights are upheld.
Exactly. And in 1986, indigenous peoples were actively participating in discussions to revise this very convention, pushing for stronger wording on self-determination and land rights, which, as we've said, are absolutely fundamental to their well-being.
The yearbook mentions that IWGIA was an observer at this ILO meeting. So it just shows they're not just documenting the struggle, they're actively involved in supporting these efforts.
That's one of the things that impressed me most about IWGIA, their commitment to amplifying indigenous voices and advocating for their rights on this global stage.
And it's not just happening at the international level. The yearbook is full of stories of indigenous communities on the ground fighting for their land rights.
Absolutely. Think about the Mapuche in Chile, the Guayani in Panama, the Aboriginal people in Australia. They're all facing immense pressure, but they're standing their ground, refusing to give up their claims to their ancestral lands.
And then there's this pretty shocking revelation from the yearbook. The World Bank, which, often presents itself as a champion of development, actually has a secret internal policy on tribal peoples that's weaker than their public guidelines.
Yes, that's right. And the yearbook exposed this double standard. It sparked a lot of criticism, and it raised serious concerns about the World Bank's commitment to protecting indigenous peoples.
So what's the difference between what they say publicly and the secret policy?
Well, for one, the internal policy uses much weaker language on self-determination. And we know how central that concept is to indigenous rights. And it doesn't explicitly acknowledge the right of indigenous people to veto projects on their land, which is a huge problem.
Yeah, it's like they have one set of rules for the public and then a completely different set for behind closed doors. I mean, that totally undermines their credibility.
It does. And this discovery is a potent reminder of why we need to hold institutions accountable, even those that claim to be forces for good. They often have hidden agendas and operate in ways that contradict their public image.
Makes you wonder how many other institutions have similar secret policies that are harming indigenous communities.
That's a disturbing thought.
Yeah.
And it underscores the need for greater transparency and accountability in development work, especially when it impacts indigenous peoples. Their voices need to be heard, and their rights must be respected.
Absolutely. And that kind of brings us to the end of our deep dive into the first part of this yearbook. We're going to take a break and be back in just a minute.
Sounds great. This incident with the World Bank really highlights why this fight for Indigenous rights is so critical, even today. The issues that were raised in this 1986 IWGIA yearbook are still incredibly relevant.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it's like this time capsule, but the messages inside are so urgent.
Absolutely.
It's a stark reminder that this isn't just some historical footnote.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing battle that demands our attention.
Absolutely
You know what
right.
I mean?
And a crucial part of that is recognizing the many forms that colonization takes. It's not always as overt as, say, a military occupation.
Right. Yeah, it can be much more subtle and insidious. The yearbook talks about it being economic, cultural, even ideological.
Precisely. Think about the pressures of globalization. Indigenous communities are often pushed to conform to these market-driven models of development,
Yeah.
which can threaten their traditional economies and ways of life.
So it's almost like they're being forced to choose between economic progress and cultural survival.
It's a difficult dilemma, and it highlights the complexities of development in the context of Indigenous rights.
And then there's this whole issue of cultural appropriation,
Yes.
where Indigenous art, music, and spiritual practices are exploited for profit
Right.
without respect for their origins or meaning.
It's a form of cultural colonization, really.
Yeah.
It's often disguised as sharing or appreciation. But the power dynamics at play are deeply unequal.
Like when we see companies using Indigenous imagery in their branding and things like that, and totally divorcing it from the cultural context.
It's a commodification of culture,
Yeah.
and it contributes to the erasure of Indigenous identity
Yeah.
and the perpetuation of harmful stereotypes.
The yearbook also goes into the psychological impacts of colonization.
Oh, yes?
The way that it can erode cultural identity and self-worth. That's something that I hadn't really considered before.
That's an important point, and one that is often overlooked.
Yeah.
The trauma of colonization can be intergenerational, passed down through families and communities,
Yeah.
and it can manifest in feelings of powerlessness, alienation, and even internalized racism.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean by internalized racism.
So internalized racism happens when individuals from marginalized groups internalize the negative stereotypes and prejudices directed at them
Oh.
by the dominant society.
Okay.
So in the context of Indigenous communities, it could mean internalizing the belief that their culture is inferior or that they are somehow less deserving of rights and opportunities.
Got it. So knowing all of this, how do we move beyond this legacy of colonization? What does decolonization actually look like in practice?
That's a complex question, but the yearbook offers some guidance. It emphasizes the importance of self-determination, giving Indigenous peoples the power to control their own destinies. And that means respecting their right to govern their own territories, manage their own resources, and revitalize their own cultures.
It sounds like it's about shifting power dynamics, ensuring that Indigenous communities have a real say in the decisions that affect their lives.
Precisely. And that means supporting Indigenous-led initiatives rather than imposing solutions from the outside. It's about listening to Indigenous voices, learning from their perspectives, and becoming true allies in their struggle. You know, the yearbook is filled with examples of Indigenous communities organizing, mobilizing, and advocating for their rights. It's a testament to their resilience and their unwavering determination.
One of the things that really struck me when reading the yearbook was the sheer diversity of Indigenous experiences. It's not a monolithic group. Each community has its own unique history and culture and context.
That's such a crucial point. There's a real danger in homogenizing Indigenous peoples, erasing their individual identities and struggles. The yearbook avoids this pitfall by showcasing a wide range of perspectives and experiences from different regions of the world.
It sounds like a truly global perspective.
It is.
So what are some of the common threads that connect these diverse struggles? What unites these communities despite their differences?
Well, as we've discussed, the central demand is self-determination.
Right.
But it's also about reclaiming stolen land, protecting sacred sites, preserving traditional knowledge, and ensuring the well-being of future generations. These are all interconnected issues.
So it's not just about land rights or cultural preservation. It's about the holistic well-being of Indigenous peoples and their communities.
Exactly. And this interconnectedness extends beyond Indigenous communities themselves.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing the impact of colonization on the environment,
Yeah.
on social justice, on our understanding of history.
The yearbook really drives home this point that the fight for Indigenous rights isn't just about them.
Right.
It's a fight for all of us.
Hmm.
It's about challenging systems of oppression, promoting social justice, and building a more equitable and sustainable world for everyone.
That's a powerful way to put it.
Yeah.
It reframes the struggle for Indigenous rights as a fight for humanity itself.
And it brings us back to this question of what we can do to support this struggle. How can we be better allies? Because it can feel overwhelming, especially when we're talking about such deeply entrenched issues.
It's true, but even small actions can make a difference. The yearbook reminds us that individual choices matter. It's about educating ourselves about Indigenous issues, amplifying Indigenous voices, supporting Indigenous-led organizations, and holding institutions accountable for their actions.
And it also means examining our own complicity in these systems of oppression and being willing to challenge our own biases and
Yes.
assumptions.
Decolonization is an ongoing process that requires constant reflection and action.
Yeah.
It's not a destination, it's a journey. And it's a journey we need to undertake together
Yeah.
in solidarity with Indigenous peoples.
One thing I found really helpful in the yearbook was its focus on concrete actions that individuals and organizations can take.
Yes.
It's not just about raising awareness,
Right.
it's about translating that awareness into meaningful change.
You're right. The yearbook provides a roadmap for action. It talks about supporting land rights campaigns, advocating for policy changes, promoting Indigenous-led development projects, and challenging discrimination in all its forms. These are all tangible steps we can take to make a difference.
And it stresses the importance of building relationships with Indigenous communities based on respect, reciprocity, and a
Absolutely.
genuine desire to learn and understand.
Those relationships are the foundation for meaningful solidarity and lasting change. And they require humility, a willingness to listen, and a commitment to walking alongside Indigenous peoples in their struggle.
You know, it's striking to me how relevant the issues raised in this 1986 IWGIA yearbook still are today. It's been decades, but the core challenges remain.
It's a testament to the enduring legacy of colonization and the ongoing fight for Indigenous rights. These are deep-seated systemic issues that require sustained effort and commitment to dismantle.
It's also a reminder that progress can be slow and that setbacks are inevitable, but that doesn't mean that we should give up. The fight continues.
Fight continues.
And it's a fight worth having.
Absolutely. The future of Indigenous peoples is intricately linked to the future of our planet.
Yeah.
Their knowledge, their cultures, their connection to the land are essential for creating a more just and sustainable world for all.
It's amazing to think about the journey we've been on with this deep dive, from the struggles documented in the 1986 IWGIA yearbook to this idea of active allyship and all that. It makes me realize just how much the world has changed since then.
It has. The geopolitical landscape is completely different. I mean, the Cold War ended, the internet revolutionized communication and globalization, accelerated at an unprecedented pace.
And yet the fundamental issues facing Indigenous peoples haven't gone away.
It's true. It's a stark reminder of how deeply ingrained colonialism is and the lasting impact it continues to have. You know, that fight for self-determination, for land rights, and for cultural survival is still very much alive.
So how has the Indigenous rights movement adapted to these global changes? How have they continued to push for progress in this world that's constantly evolving?
Well, one significant development has been the rise of these international Indigenous networks and organizations.
Oh, okay.
These groups have been instrumental in amplifying Indigenous voices on the global stage, advocating for policy changes at the international level, and holding governments and corporations accountable for their actions.
The yearbook mentions the World Council of Indigenous Peoples, which was founded back in 1975. That seems like a really early example of Indigenous groups coming together to fight for their rights on this global scale.
It was a pivotal moment.
Yeah.
And in the decades since, we've seen the emergence of other very powerful organizations, like the Indigenous Peoples Caucus at the United Nations. This caucus gives Indigenous peoples a platform to participate directly in global decision-making processes, which is a huge step forward.
Yeah, like they're finally getting a seat at the table.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that presence is crucial for ensuring that Indigenous perspectives and priorities are considered in international policy and development initiatives.
The yearbook also touches on the growing recognition of Indigenous rights in international law.
Yes.
That seems like another major area of progress.
It is. A few years after the yearbook was published, a new ILO convention, number 169, was adopted in 1989. And this is a landmark agreement
Okay.
because it clearly establishes the right of indigenous peoples to self-determination,
Yeah.
to consultation and participation in matters that affect them.
So it's not just lip service anymore. There's like an actual legal.
Right. It's a legally binding agreement that recognizes their inherent rights.
Yeah.
And that was followed by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007, which was another massive win for indigenous communities worldwide.
Okay.
This declaration affirms a broad spectrum of their collective rights, from cultural identity to land and resources.
These legal instruments seem incredibly powerful, but I imagine there's a difference between having laws on the books
Yes.
and actually seeing them implemented and enforced.
You're absolutely right. The challenge lies in translating these legal frameworks into real change on the ground.
Right.
And that requires continued advocacy, pressure from indigenous peoples and their allies, and holding governments accountable to their commitments.
Yeah.
The fight for indigenous rights is a long game. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
That's a good way to put it. So I'm glad to see that kind of progress happening on a global stage. The yearbook also highlighted something else that I found really interesting. The idea of indigenous-led development. What does that mean?
So indigenous-led development is about ensuring that development initiatives actually benefit indigenous communities and are designed in a way that aligns with their values,
Yeah.
their priorities, and their traditional knowledge systems.
It makes sense because too often development is imposed on communities without their consent or their participation, leading to, displacement,
Yes.
environmental damage, and cultural disruption.
And indigenous-led development flips that model on its head.
Yeah.
The yearbook gives examples of communities taking control of their own destinies, managing their resources sustainably, revitalizing their economies, and reclaiming their traditional practices.
It's a reminder that sustainable development can't just be about economic growth.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be culturally appropriate and respect the rights and knowledge of indigenous peoples.
You've hit the nail on the head. And this approach is gaining traction globally. We're seeing a growing recognition of the importance of indigenous-led conservation,
Yeah.
traditional ecological knowledge, and sustainable resource management.
It's almost like the world is starting to catch up to what indigenous communities have known for centuries.
In many ways, yes. There's this growing understanding that we have a lot to learn from indigenous peoples, not just about the past, but about how to create a more just and sustainable future for everyone. Their worldviews, their values, their deep connection to the land offer invaluable insights into how we can live in harmony with nature and with each other.
As we wrap up our deep dive into the 1986 IWGIA yearbook, it feels like we've covered so much ground. What stands out to you as the most important takeaway for our listener?
For me, the core message is this. The fight for indigenous rights is an ongoing struggle, and it's a fight that we all have a stake in. Whether it's educating ourselves, amplifying indigenous voices, supporting indigenous-led initiatives, or holding those in power accountable, we all have a role to play in creating a world where indigenous peoples can thrive and their rights are fully realized.
It's been a powerful reminder that even small actions can make a difference. This deep dive has definitely left me feeling inspired to learn more and get involved in whatever ways I can.
That's wonderful to hear. Remember, the journey toward a more just and equitable world is a collective one. We need to stand in solidarity with indigenous peoples and support their right to self-determination, cultural survival, and a future where their voices are heard and their contributions are valued.
Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through the 1986 IWGIA yearbook. We hope it sparked your curiosity and ignited a passion for learning more about the fight for indigenous rights.
And remember, this is just the beginning. There's a wealth of information out there waiting to be explored. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep advocating for a better future for all